Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Herdt. I'm one of the 3 co-organizers of this conference, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Yale Divinity School for AI and the Ends of Humanity. We will do a more formal welcome and launch of the conference after lunch when Dean Greg Sterling will be here to welcome all of you on behalf of the school. So I'm not going to do all of that now, but I'm just delighted that we have a graduate panel to commence this conference. And I just want to say that scholars of my generation recognize the importance of thinking through the issues raised by AI, but we're conscious that in some respects, digital natives have an edge over us. So we're getting some digital natives in the room. We issued a call for papers for this graduate panel, and we received over 60 submissions. So we were thrilled to get that level of response, and it was very tough competition and very difficult to pick 3 papers only for this panel. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all 3 of our presenters, and they'll go ahead and present in the order that they are found on the program. After each, I will take just one question, and then we'll move on to the next paper, but at the end, there will be ample time for Q&A and exchange. So our first speaker this morning is Jordan Baker. Jordan Baker is a second-year M.Div student at Yale Divinity School and a candidate for ordination in the ELCA Lutheran Church. Jordan also has a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. His philosophical work has focused on non-causal accounts of volition, group agency, and interlevel metaphysics. And his talk today is entitled Algorithmic Trust and Agential Possession. So for the non-philosophers in the room, we're giving you this early while you're still fresh. Our second speaker is Baz-Garza. He is a Ph.D. student in theology and ethics at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. He's interested in Christian thought broadly construed, and his current research revolves around questions of violence and peace, as well as the nature of personal identity. He received an M.Div from Yale Divinity School in 2024 after having earned a BA in religion at Florida Southern College. He is also a candidate for ordination in the Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church, and we're happy to welcome Sean back to YDS. The title of his talk today is Theology, AI, and Internal-External Goods. Our third speaker is Johanna Merz, who is a doctoral candidate in comparative literature at LMU Munich, where she also previously received a degree in comparative literature with minors in Romance Studies and Theology. As that begins to indicate, she works at the intersection of literature, philosophy, and religion. Her focus is on the sacramentality of language and the interplay of dependency, longing, and freedom. Her dissertation, The Phenomenology of Grace, aims at identifying the aesthetic dimensions of grace with regard to literature, presenting grace as a poetic phenomenon. Her talk this morning is titled AI, Fragility, and Creative Freedom. So you begin to sense what an interdisciplinary conversation this will be, and I hope that you will join me in welcoming first Jordan Baker to the podium.
All right, before I get started, I had every intention to get you a handout to kind of follow along at home, but due to my own lack of preparedness, it was not printed. I think it might be emailed to you for those of you who have devices, is what I was told, so you can follow along at home, as it were. Research in AI safety and AI ethics has grown extensively in the past 15 years, but most of this literature has focused on 2 types of harm that come from AI usage. This research has been very helpful, very vital. However, for understandable reasons, it has tended to focus on kinds of harm that appear in the consequences of AI usage. With this project, what I'm hoping to do is to broaden our ethical vision beyond ascriptions of harm and also beyond the domain of consequences. So the project really has three goals. First, I want to articulate a kind of ethical wrong that follows from certain sorts of AI and algorithmic usage, one that is not grounded in harmful consequences. Second, I hope to show that this wrong follows from a constitutive feature of certain AI and algorithmic systems, namely the kind of agency that makes these systems what they are, in conjunction with a certain kind of usage, what I'm going to call integrative usage. And then finally, third, I aim to show that in both naming and conceptualizing this wrong, we should use a concept from Christian theology and religious practice because of its structural similarity to what is going on in the AI case. And to give you all some sense of where this is going, and perhaps as a tantalizing preview, the concept I hope to apply is that of demonic possession, especially as understood in the writings of the Desert Mothers and Fathers and John Cassian's conferences. But more on that in a moment. This presentation is going to be in two parts. Part one provides my core ethical argument regarding AI, and then part two will note this similarity between AI and demonic possession. Let me begin part one by providing sort of a 1,000-foot view of my argument, just so we can kind of place ourselves. My argument has four premises. Premise one, AI agents are constitutively different from human agents, in particular because of how they configure normative structures, or more colloquially, how they represent value. Premise two, AI usage under certain circumstances involves taking up an integrative stance towards the AI tool, which means that the human agent integrates the tool into their own agency as a kind of mental extension. Premise three, human agency and AI agency, when so integrated, are intrinsically mismatched, at least with respect to their normative architecture. I think this kind of follows from 1 and 2. And then premise 4, this conflict often results in what I call the diabolical exchange, wherein the AI tool's representations of value take precedence over the human agent's representations of value. My conclusion is that this exchange ethically wrongs the human agent by instrumentalizing their own agential judgments for the sake of the AI system's judgment. So let's dig into this in some more detail. I will briefly mention that nothing I say, especially in these next two parts, is going to be without some philosophical controversy, but I'm going to move past the fundamental disagreements to get to the ethical issue at hand. So I see agency here as a concept with types that are identified by their constitutive features. And I'm using constitutive to mean roughly the features in virtue of which it is the entity that it is. I claim the key constitutive difference between agencies lies in their normative architecture, how they configure value or what is worth doing. And I'm going to focus here on two types, and I'm going to specify them according to how they configure the agent's goals, the relationship between the agent and those goals, and the location of the value of those goals. So the first type is what I'm calling propositional agency. A propositional agent configures goals as valueless propositions about future states of affairs, configures the agent's relation to these goals as essentially productive, and configures value as exclusively in the attitudes of the agent, not the content of those attitudes. This is to be contrasted with dialectical agency, which first configures goals as an apprehension of value that need not be propositionally specifiable. It might be, but it need not be. It configures the agent's relationship to these goals as not essentially productive, so other relations are possible. And then finally, it configures value as primarily within the objects of representation. Thus, the agent is moved by the content of their representations, what we might call their evaluative outlook, and not the attitude itself. Now, what is interesting about this account is that propositional agency, so the first version, can encompass forms of agency that lack conscious mental states. This is because all three agential conditions can be met by states that play merely functional roles. In contrast, dialectical agency seems to essentially require the ability to represent value as value, a kind of evaluative outlook, which arguably cannot be done without some sort of mentality. If so, then what I want to say is that AI is a purely functional propositional agent. Its configuration of value can only be formal and productive, at least for the AI agent itself, and it requires its goals to be well defined. In contrast, we as humans seem to be dialectical agents. Often we are moved to action by representations of value that are inchoate, that we cannot specify, and that we wish to deepen our understanding of through the activity of engagement. Now, if this argument holds, there is always going to be some danger of agential mismatch between different kinds of agential systems. This leads to premise 2. So if premise 1 concerned the constitutive conditions of these different types of agencies, premise 2 concerns how we use them. The first thing to note is that AI is often marketed as a tool, not as an agent. This leads us to ask, what does it mean to trust our tools? And here I want to rely on social epistemologist C.T. Nguyen's work on how we trust objects. What he says is that we trust objects in part to relieve our cognitive burden by allowing ourselves to take up an unquestioning attitude towards those objects that structure our life. This kind of trust functions by expanding our agency through integrating elements of the external world into our own functioning. Thus, tools are an appropriate object of trust precisely because we have taken up what Nguyen calls an integrative stance towards them. We see them as if they are an extension of our own agency, a functional whole that we trust to enact our will in various ways. To use Nguyen's evocative language, quote, "The unquestioning attitude lets me give external resources a direct pipeline into my cognitive and practical functioning. To trust something is to let it in, to let it muck about directly with one's practical and cognitive innards," end quote. This then leads to the source of the ethical wrong that I want to describe, which is basically premise 3 in my argument. AI marketing has often invited people to see AI as a tool, but AI is itself an agent masquerading as a tool. Even worse, it's a form of agency that is alien to our own. Yet, instead of treating it as an alien agent that we are collaborating with, perhaps with some suspicion, we are increasingly invited, if not forced, to rely upon it. That is to say, we are asked to trust it, to integrate it into our own agency. Just so, I worry that AI might extend our agency, genuinely, but it does so in part by subtly shifting our goals towards ones that fit a merely functional agent. To make these ideas concrete and to kind of bring us into premise 4 of my argument, let me briefly turn to a real-life medical case. This case does not feature any of the current generations of generative foundational AI models. This is in part for simplicity's sake, but the extension to current AI models I think will be obvious. So this is a case of algorithmically mediated healthcare from 2013 as described in Cheney Leopold's book, We Are Data. Quote, "In 2013, a 41-year-old British disabled man, Mark Hemmings, dials the number for emergency services. An operator answers, and Hemmings immediately makes his condition known. 'My stomach is in agony, and I've got lumps in my stomach.' The operator responds with the first of many inquiries. 'Have you got any other symptoms?' Hemming replies, 'I'm in agony, I'm sweating a lot, feeling weak.' The operator asks more questions, and through this agony, Hemmings diligently but excruciatingly answers all of these questions. He requests an ambulance. If you listen to the transcript, he requests the ambulance at least 3 separate times. He also explains his pain in both description and accompanying tone as agonizing, a heartbreaking 7 times. At the end of the call, the operator concludes, 'From what you told me, you don't require an emergency ambulance, but we will get somebody to call you back.' 2 days later, an in-house healthcare worker discovered Hemmings collapsed and unconscious on the floor, rushed to the hospital. He died about 30 minutes after arrival." The reason for this tragic call, the reason it unfolded as it did, is because the emergency operator was going through a series of questions generated by a medical algorithm that was supposed to judge whether someone needed emergency services. This is an example of a merely functional agency in some ways, one in which Hemmings' agony was illegible to that algorithmic system. This much is obvious. But I want to instead focus on the emergency operator in this case. It's the operator's human response that I think is in some ways puzzling. We should expect AI to be bad at these kinds of judgments. We might have thought that the human person operating the phone could have responded to the agony in Hemming's voice. Instead, the operator trusted the medical technology so much that they verbally affirmed, again on the transcript, quote, "There are paramedics in the control room for us to ask, but I would not think the system would come up with the wrong answer." They even repeat the script given by the algorithm at the end of the call, saying absurdly, "If you collapse or become unconscious or unresponsive, call 999. One natural explanation is that the emergency operator trusts that the judgment rendered by their algorithmic tools are accurate, and they are willing to ignore or filter countervailing evidence through this alien agency. It has reshaped their evaluative outlook. We might say that the system acts through them. But, as a reminder, my focus here is not on harmful outcomes, but instead ethical wrongs. So let's imagine a different version of the case where all the details are the same, but the algorithmic diagnosis was correct, and Hemmings did not die. I think there's still something wrong happening here. Agency requires the ability to set and enact goals, usually understood in dialectical agents as applying a certain evaluative outlook to a given situation. But in this case, the operator has given over, or been forced to give over, the value ascribing part of their agency to the algorithm. The algorithm is conferring what is valuable within the situation. What the algorithm lacks is an ability to interact with the physical world. Thus, what the algorithm needs, if you will, is a tool that it can incorporate within itself to produce the state of affairs that has been selected. The algorithm cannot tell Hemmings directly that his hospital ride has been denied, at least not in 2013. It cannot directly hang up the phone, but the operator can. Thus, we come to the conclusion of the ethical side of my argument. I think the core ethical wrong intrinsic to the integrative relationship between these mismatched agencies is that the integrative artificial agent becomes the dominating agent, and the integrating human agent becomes the tool. Through this diabolical exchange, the human user of AI or other artificial agential tools not only disrespects their own agency, but they become parties to their own agential domination. This wrong would persist even if there were no harmful consequences. So this then leads us to part two. I'm going to focus, well, let me start with this. In standard discussions of instrumentalization and ethics, there's not really a good single concept that captures this particular kind of instrumentalizing harm when your agency becomes captured by an alien agent. And this is why I think we are justified in appealing to a theological concept to do some of this work, namely the concept of demonic possession. I make this comparison not to sensationalize AI products. I'm not saying AI is literally demons, right? But I just want to note that what some have called an unprecedented moment might actually have some analogies to early Christian discussions of demonology. In this final section, I want to focus on three aspects of demonic possession: its structure, its process, and its moral wrongness, and how they relate to AI possession, thus hopefully clearing the way for a more generic understanding of agential possession. So first, the structure of possession. I'm going to focus on two structural features here: the structure of demonic vision and the structure of the demonic will. Starting with vision, early church theologians have suggested that demons do not have access directly to the soul or seat of the will. Though the demons can certainly offer suggestions to the human mind, grounded in memories or desires or hopes that they see in the person, these spirits cannot literally make anyone do anything without first being accepted. John Cassian recounts in his conferences that a demon's knowledge of us is through observation of behavior. He goes on to compare demon's knowledge to an insightful man who predicts behavior because of his vast experience. For the contemporary reader, I think these accounts have a haunting resemblance to Zuboff's description of surveillance capitalism and the instrumentarian power, which, quote, unilaterally claims human experience as a free, raw resource for translation into behavioral data. This data is used for many purposes, but in our case, I'll emphasize its use for the training of ever more responsive AI agents. The AI interprets what you might want almost before you do. Importantly, like the demons, the instrumentarian system is powerful because of its way of seeing and how that seeing is then operationalized into predictive and behavioral modifying technologies. The other structural analogy concerns the demonic agency itself. Demons, like AI, are differentiated according to their normative architecture. Origen calls them the other order of rational creatures who differ in that, quote, they have devoted themselves to wickedness so precipitously that they are unwilling rather than unable to recall themselves, as the frenzy for wicked deeds is now a passion and gives delight. This seems to mark off demonic agency as alien precisely because of the possibility that it could act for the sake of the bad, something that seems impossible for human agents, at least as traditionally understood. But as we have already seen, AI agency is alien precisely because it's blind to certain representations of value. It seems at least possible that artificial agents could, in principle, pursue evil for evil's sake, since evil is understood by the artificial agent as just some arbitrary category assigned an agential weight in its decision procedure. If so, then there's a sense in which the AI agency is at least possibly diabolical in the technical sense of the term. There's nothing within the agent that prevents that possibility. This leads then to the second aspect of an analogy between demonic possession and AI agency that I want to discuss, which is how possession happens, the process of possession. All of the early Christian authors emphasize that the influence of demons, even possession by them, requires the subject to allow possession. Possession comes about through seduction of some sort. The demon gains access to the individual by representing some value as both desirable to the person and attainable. This is, of course, precisely how AI products are marketed as well. Tech companies have access to our private data, and they want to optimize the seductive qualities of various kinds of AI technologies. But there's another side to the seduction as well. These technologies, after all, do not eliminate choice. Again, they can't get into the soul. But they function by seducing us with value, clarity, and agential simplicity, both of which are desirable because they give us a feeling of control and power without having to deal with the messiness of reality. In a similar way to how demons address the difficulties and ambiguities of the monastic life by offering the monk what seems like a clear, quantifiable, and actionable alternative: money, sex, power. Finally, this leads, in conclusion, to the last analogy I want to draw, which is the wrong of possession as understood in these early Christian theologies. One of the remarkable features of these early Christian demonologies is the relatively mild rebuke of monks who have found themselves bodily possessed. Instead, it is those monks whose own will has become possessed by sinful passions that are more seriously reprimanded. There's several examples of this. Cassian has a really, really nice one, which I'm not going to go into for the sake of time. But the basic idea is that one can distinguish between two types of demonic activity in terms of its moral threat to the person who's been possessed. On the one hand, there is possession by seduction. On the other hand, there is possession by agreement. In the first case, there is certainly a kind of moral culpability on the part of the monk, but there's also a kind of resistance. The monk feels a mismatch in their body between how the demon is structuring their desires and what their will actually wants to do. And this mismatch has the possibility of shaking them out of it. In contrast, for the monk who has themselves taken up certain sinful practices, certain sinful desires, their will has become aligned with the demon, such that they don't even recognize the temptation as temptation. It just becomes aligned with their own evaluative outlook. They could potentially be possessed without even knowing it. So what I want to conclude with is the thought that one of the things we learn from looking at these Christian traditions is that our response, both ethically and sociopolitically, to the potential possession of AI, the different ways in which people are either seduced by AI or deceived by AI versus in agreement with AI structures, that our response might have to differ depending on where people occupy in this sort of possession framework. And I want to end with one final wrinkle to this. So there's possession by seduction, possession by agreement. There's also the possibility of possession by contract. Now, this is not talked about in the early church fathers, but it comes up in later Christian thinkers, the sort of deal with the devil idea. And what I just want to note is the way they talk about that does start to sound a lot like how certain advocates and thought leaders and industry leaders of AI talk about a sort of techno-utopian framework, an entire worldview that frames the world as functionally structured as far as its value is concerned. I think an interesting question then moving forward is, what are the kinds of practices of resistance that perhaps we find in the early church texts that could allow us to not only resist the seductive powers of AI, but also maybe fight against those who have made a contract? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lots to think about there. We have time to take one question. Yes, please. Try to speak. We should have a mic here somewhere. Okay, terrific.
Test. Okay. Thanks. That was really interesting. So you talk about the harm to our agency that can come from relying on the judgments or the goals of these AI systems rather than on our own agency. I mean, the example you gave was a case where the AI had bad judgment, was probably less reliable than the human would have been. I wonder whether you can speak to the case where we're dealing with an AI that's more reliable than us. And I mean, in many domains we already have that, so if I want to know what's the fastest route to get to some destination, I look at Google Maps, and it doesn't seem to harm my agency in any significant way, if like, oh, that's not the route I would have thought was best, but it probably knows best. I think, that's a reasonable judgment. And like even in the medical domain, I've heard of tests where ChatGPT actually does better than doctors at diagnosing certain illnesses. And in fact, even if you compare like doctors using AI as an aid to just unassisted AI, the AI still does better. So, maybe that's only in limited domains. But where we have a domain where we know that the AI is more reliable than us at getting whatever we're aiming at, how is that harmful to just kind of rely on it in just the way that we would rely on a human expert?
Good, thank you. That's a really excellent question. So I suppose I have like three sorts of thoughts regarding this. One is to note that my concern here, of course, is again not really with the harm. It's with the possibility of wronging yourself, that there's a way in which you make yourself an instrument or disrespect your own agency by giving your judgments over to an AI system. So what that means is that there's going to be scenarios where you could use an AI system, but you don't integrate it in that way. Like you recognize that the AI's way of judging value is different than yours, and so you don't just unquestioningly trust its sort of evaluative judgments. This is related to the second thing I was thinking, which is it also might depend a lot on like what values are at stake. Like deciding the most efficient route, a kind of, prudential, very grounded sort of value, might be very, very different than something that perhaps is in principle unmeasurable. So I think of people trying to deploy AI in like counseling situations where we might think that there's something about the value of a person that can't be like represented in an AI system, like in principle. And if so, then we might have more reason to worry that integrating yourself in that kind of AI system would be wrong in the way I'm suggesting, and could also lead to harm. But even if it didn't, it would still definitely be wrong because it's basically causing you to perceive value in the wrong way, which is, and also the wronging of yourself. But the last little bit here that I think is maybe worth noting is one of the kind of reoccurring targets in this talk, or at least what I was trying to gesture at, is a sort of deep suspicion of the way in which AI is marketed and how it sort of aligns with certain larger forces that are in the background, whether those are profit-seeking forces or the kind of techno-utopian sort of ideal, often which are grounded in a kind of behaviorist understanding of value itself, like very functional behaviorist structure. I think what I would want to say is the danger, even in these ideal cases where it seems to work well, is the way it sort of habituates us to thinking that that's the way the world is structured in general, and makes us thus vulnerable to other kinds of even broader errors. So again, the thought there is there's a kind of caution that's necessary, even in maybe the ideal cases. Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm sure there are many more questions, so jot them down and save them for later. But now please join me in welcoming Sean Baz-Garza.
Good morning. It is really wonderful to be here, and I want to thank the conference organizers for accepting the paper. So let's get started. Within the humanities fields especially today, as I'm sure you all know, there's much disagreement about the ways that artificial intelligence technology should affect our work. Some resist its implementation wholeheartedly, arguing that it presents an unqualified threat to the humanistic disciplines. Others, the more tech-friendly among us, argue that scholars should embrace these technologies because of the ways that they can assist in completing work more quickly, more efficiently, and with fewer mistakes. In this paper, I will attempt to sketch a different path. With the help of Alasdair MacIntyre, I will argue that this binary rejection-acceptance paradigm is in the end unhelpful. I will do so by developing MacIntyre's concept of practice internal goods in relation to specifically Christian theological work, showing that while some uses of AI should be shunned within the Theological Academy, others may be perfectly legitimate. I will first articulate just what MacIntyre means by a practice, and just what he means by practice internal goods. This first section will take up the majority of our time. I will then, in conversation with John Webster and Lynn Tonstad, situate Christian theology as a practice, and articulate a far from exhaustive set of goods that I take to be internal to it. I will conclude by all too briefly making the connections between this conception of the practice and goods of theology and the possibilities and limitations afforded to theologians by artificial intelligence. MacIntyre's discussion of practices occurs in chapter 14 of After Virtue. By practice, he notes at the outset that he means something quite different than most people do when they use the word. He offers the following definition, and it's a bit lengthy, so bear with me. A practice is, quote, any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity, with the result that human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended, unquote. This is, as I said, a long definition with many moving parts, so allow me to unpack it step by step. I divide the definition into three primary components. The first names four characteristics of a practice that constitute it as such. It is 1, coherent, 2, complex, 3, socially established, and 4, cooperative. Coherence regards teloi. Practices have aims and ends. They exist to achieve those aims and ends. Think here of medicine, a human activity, the common naming of which as a practice corresponds to MacIntyre's definition. Medicine is a coherent practice in that it has an identifiable aim, namely the promotion of the health of the person. Without coherence governed by articulable teloi, an activity cannot count as a practice. Practices are complex in that they involve more than one component action. Medicine again serves as a helpful example. Medical practitioners do more than one thing. It is not as if physicians administer one medication in one way for the treatment of all diseases, nor do surgeons learn one technique. Nevertheless, each activity performed by a physician or a surgeon within the context of the practice of medicine aims in some way toward the well-being of the person. Medicine is recognized in this sense as a coherent form of a complex human activity. Practices then are coherent and complex. When McIntyre says that a practice is socially established, he means that it is necessarily carried out within a community in which and to which it is intelligible. Take chess, one of McIntyre's own favorite examples. The rules and aims of chess are socially established and agreed upon by the community of chess players, both past and present. Learning to play chess, then, entails being inducted into the community of chess players. Until one is so inducted, one cannot engage, technically speaking, in the practice. One might move pieces around on a board, one might knock over their opponent's pieces and put them to one side, but until one learns the socially established rules of the game, one cannot actually play it. Practices then are coherent, complex, and socially established. Cooperation, the fourth characteristic named in this first component of the definition, is also related to the communal setting of McIntyrean practices, and it has two primary senses. The first is this: one cannot participate in a practice without cooperating with the socially established criteria that constitute it. This is a different, albeit connected, point to the previous one. One can, for instance, know the rules of chess, and in that limited sense belong to the chess-playing community, but it does not necessarily follow that they will care for those rules. McIntyre gives the example of a child who cheats at the game because they will receive candy upon winning. The cheating child does not, properly speaking, participate in the practice. The second, related sense of cooperation is this: a single individual cannot, on this account, perform a practice without either referring to or relying on other individuals. The chess player refers their activity to the opponent and relies on the opponent to cooperate with the rules of the game. Returning to the medical surgical example, the cardiac surgeon cannot replace a diseased aortic valve without referring that act to the good of the patient. Otherwise, it would not be cardiac surgery, but a different act entirely, nor could they without relying on the cooperation of the scrub nurse, the perfusionist, and the anesthesiologist. In short, without cooperation, practices break down. Practices then are coherent, complex, socially established, and cooperative. The second component of McIntyre's definition claims that through partaking in a particular practice, goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity. The two important terms here are internal goods and standards of excellence. McIntyre contrasts external goods, those which are in principle achievable irrespective of means, with internal goods, and he uses the example of the cheating chess player to illustrate the difference. The candy the child hopes to obtain is a quintessential external good. The internal goods of chess, on the other hand, include, quote, a highly particular kind of analytical skill, strategic imagination, and competitive intensity, and these are not achievable irrespective of means. To attain the internal goods of chess, one must genuinely engage in the game, doing all one can to meet its standards of excellence. Cheating obviously fails to meet those standards, so, however, does playing in a lazy or disinterested manner. McIntyre claims that all practices have internal standards of excellence and that the same dynamic applies across the board. While it may be impossible to cheat at the practice of farming in quite the same way as chess, it is possible to cut corners, to hold back from fully committing to the standards of excellence appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity. If one does so, one fails to lay hold of the internal goods of farming. It is important to note at this point that internal goods are not identical with ends. They are inseparable from ends, certainly, but not identical. Theoretically, it is possible to engage in a practice well enough to realize its internal goods without ever achieving its stated ends. Imagine for a moment a dedicated tennis player who trains consistently, shows up to tournaments, and plays their heart out each and every match. Imagine further that they have never won and that they likely never will, for they've had the particular misfortune of living in a place where all other tennis players are at least 6'7" and possess untouchable serves. Repeated losses do not, in this instance, in any sense negate the fact that our dedicated player achieves goods internal to the practice of tennis. They know the satisfaction of a beautifully struck forehand or a deftly placed drop shot. They've experienced the joys of athletic development, and athletic development of a particular sort. At one point in their life, they could not hit a clean forehand, and now they can. We could go even further and say that they attain the internal goods of tennis to a greater degree than the tall, big servers to whom they consistently lose. For the tall, big servers are capable of relying on only one component of the game to the neglect of the others. They may never know the satisfaction of a well-placed drop shot. The first two components of McIntyre's definition are now fully on the table. Practices are coherent, complex, socially established, and cooperative, and we achieve their internal goods as we attempt to meet their standards of excellence. Allow me to briefly explicate the third and final component before we move on to the next section. McIntyre claims that by engaging in practices of this sort, quote, human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended. What this means is simple enough. Committed performance of a practice leads to a deepened understanding of both human capacities and the possibilities for the practice in question. In other words, the more we do something, the more we learn to do it, and the more we learn what there is to do. Cardiac surgery is again a case in point. As physicians and surgeons performed their craft over the course of history, they realized both the need for and the possibility of operating on the heart. Using that knowledge, skills, and tools at their disposal, knowledge, skills, and tools developed throughout the course of engaging in the practice, they developed ways of doing just that. Turning now to the next section, I will situate theology in relation to McIntyre's conception of a practice. I will do so in conversation with John Webster and Lynn Tonstad, although I must say at the outset that my decision to engage these interlocutors is in one sense quite limited, which of course would be the case no matter the two interlocutors I chose. Theology as practiced is a multivalent enterprise, one with many competing definitions, methodologies, and aims, and Webster and Tonstad do not nearly exhaust the possibilities. My argument and conclusions in this paper would look rather different had I engaged different theologians with different backgrounds and commitments, and I urge you all to keep that in mind. Think of this as more of a thought experiment exploring the role AI should play if theology is this kind of practice with these particular aims and goods, than a pronouncement of the only possible option. That said, there is another sense in which my decision to engage these two theologians together is quite fitting. For Webster's work represents a recent attempt in Western academic theology to define the discipline. While most theologians have said and continue to say something about the nature and purpose of theology, Webster made the question central to his work, dedicating to it a number of inaugural lectures and other essays. Tonstad, on the other hand, offers us a contrasting perspective that is explicitly critical of Webster's, and she reminds us of the provisionality of all theological claims. We begin with Webster. In an essay titled, "What Makes Theology Theological?" Webster writes that, quote, the object of theology is twofold, God, the Holy Trinity, and all other things relative to God. The telos of theology on this account is to bring thought into accordance with that reality, God and all things relative to God. Herein lies theology's coherence, the first necessary characteristic of a practice. While God, theology's primary object, is metaphysically simple, the means theologians employ to approach God are manifold. Webster names 4 distinct areas of theological inquiry: the historical study of Scripture, church, and doctrine, the literary analysis of both biblical and extra-biblical texts, the speculative development of systematic and constructive theologies, and the moral practical endeavors of both Christian ethical reflection and ministerial formation. Each of these diverse areas are, for Webster, components of theology, and properly ordered, they aim toward fostering knowledge of God and all things in relation to God. Theology, then, is coherent and complex. Most often, theology takes place within the academy. However, theology is accountable not only to the academy, but also to the church. There are then not one but 2 senses in which theology is socially established. On the face of it, this complicates our ability to think of theology as a practice in any neat McIntyrean sense, for the academy and the church espouse supposedly different standards of excellence. Webster certainly thinks this. In Theological Theology, the inaugural lecture he gave when installed as the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Oxford, Webster argued that theology should not accommodate itself to the standards of the modern research university because those standards are foreign to, and therefore malformative of, the theological enterprise. This is so, in his view, because the modern research university is premised upon the ideals of Wissenschaft, a form of intellectual inquiry, quote, concerned with practices which transcend all localities and summon those localities for review, unquote. Theology, though, as a discipline of the church, cannot transcend all localities. When it tries for Webster, it loses its communal intelligibility. For Webster, then, the social establishment of theology is primarily an ecclesial establishment, even a divine establishment, and its current social location within the university is only secondary. In this account, theology is cooperative insofar as it seeks to respond to divine revelation, as well as to the church's reflection on divine revelation. In other words, to practice theology is to cooperate with the socially, i.e. ecclesially, established criteria that constitute it. Theology is also cooperative in that it refers to and relies upon others, namely God and the church. Thus construed, theology counts as a practice in the McIntyrean sense. In a recent essay titled Unwise Theologians, Systematic Theology in the University, Tonstad critiques Webster's approach and thus provides another angle through which we can think of theology as a practice. While Webster views theology's relation to divine revelation as reason to hold it above other intellectual disciplines, indeed to hold it as the ordering principle of other intellectual disciplines, Tonstad thinks the opposite is the case. For what God reveals is the incapability of human thought to grasp God and all things in relation to God, even theological thought. Therefore, theology cannot claim privileged status in relation to other disciplines, for its own basis is one that displaces all claims to intellectual privilege. Further, Tonstad argues that insofar as Webster claims that theology's setting within the university is secondary to its identity, he fails to attend to the actual ways this setting impacts the practice of theology. Theology, she writes, cannot but be affected by its position inside the modern university. It comes to value what the modern university rewards, things like originality, productivity, and prestige. Remember that Webster gave theological theology when he was appointed to a chaired professorship at Oxford. From Tonstad's perspective, this fact should have played more of a role in the lecture, for an important theological task is recognizing the ways in which all intellectual work, not just non-theological intellectual work, is mired in the problematic habits, desires, and structures of modern university life. Tonstad's critique of Webster seems to me spot on, but I do not think that their respective positions on the practice of theology are wholly incompatible. In fact, I think that Tonstad's critique functions as a corrective, one that shares and builds upon some foundational assumptions, such as the priority of God's action in the disruptive event of revelation. That said, we are now in a position to articulate a few internal goods of theology with reference to Webster and Tonstad, and to finally bring this discussion to bear on artificial intelligence. First, theology leads one to engage with the world. If we affirm Webster's claim that theology is about God and all things in relation to God, then one cannot properly participate in the practice of theology without attending to the world, without nurturing care for the world. Theology forces one to ask, how does this particular thing, this flower, for instance, relate to God? What is God's purpose for it? One can certainly make theological claims and think theological thoughts without developing this kind of attention and care, but I contend that this does not qualify as practicing theology. Second, theology forces one to slow down. It engenders patience, as Webster argues elsewhere. Results are not immediate. Indeed, they are only verifiable eschatologically, a point Tonstad makes. Theologians must be patient, then, with regard to their conclusions. Further, reading and writing, the activities at the heart of the theological disciplines, take time, and reading and writing well take even more. Theology is slow work. Even further still, theology as a socially established and socially embedded practice requires patience with others, both the living and the dead. Third, and finally, theology fosters openness to failure, as Tonstad convincingly argues. She writes in Unwise Theologians that, quote, because theology, faithful to divine self-revelation, though it may wish to be, is not identical with such revelation, it cannot but participate in incompletion. This incompletion, she contends, is one of theology's virtues rather than a fault, a virtue that should lead to openness to others, to the peaceable relativization of one's own claims to truth, aimed at listening for the truth in the voice of another. To the extent that this does not happen, a failure has occurred, an internal good gone unrealized. Okay, what might this all mean for artificial intelligence? For one, it means that forms of artificial intelligence that hinder one's engagement with and attention to the world, one's ability to exercise patience when necessary, in all of the necessary contexts in which that happens to be the case, and or one's openness to failure have no place within the practice of theology. However, insofar as there are forms of AI that do not hinder the achievement of these internal goods, theologians have no reason to reject them. In fact, theologians may celebrate rather than just tolerate forms of AI that further capacities for these internal goods and others. The primary task of theologians then in relation to AI is to learn to use it responsibly, to learn to order it rightly toward theology's ends, because use it and order it they will. What this looks like cannot be determined from the outset. Rather, it requires the exercise of practical reason within specific contexts, practical reason formed by and responsive to the practice of theology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can take a question.
You left me hanging there at the end. I was wondering if you could give some examples of that you might have in mind of what would be a responsible use and an irresponsible use of AI in theology.
That's a good question. I've thought about this, and I'm not entirely sure that I can. I think well, let me think. A possibility, maybe a responsible use of something like a large language model. Let's say one is trying to find commonalities or differences within a certain set of texts. One can use a large language model to assist them in doing that. That doesn't kind of take over the work for them, but enables them to do the work in a shorter amount of time. But they don't kind of lose the necessary responsiveness to the text with which they're working. But that's a question I need to think more about, and it's one that I hope others will pursue.
Sounds like you set the agenda for the rest of our time together. So save the other questions and we will return. But now for our third speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to be here. So debates about AI often revolve around the question, let me just check the time first, often revolve around the question of the extent to which AI is capable of performing at a human level. This question becomes particularly pressing when it concerns capacities traditionally regarded as intrinsically human, such as the ability to express affection or empathy, for instance, in discussions about robots potentially replacing caregivers or romantic partners. Or art, the crown of human labor, which in its gratuitousness sets itself apart from the purposeful activities of other living beings. The artistic achievements of a gifted few among us bestow upon all of humanity a specific and unique dignity. This certainty about our capability of painting, writing poetry, and composing symphonies, as well as the notion of humanity that is drawn from it, begins to falter when AI starts winning prizes for its creations and renders human creativity seemingly obsolete. What remains of humanity when there is nothing left that AI cannot do or even do better? I want to approach this widely posed and deeply significant question by challenging its underlying premise. For debates of this kind typically define the human being primarily in terms of capability. They conceive of the human through what he or she can do. More than that, they regard human capacities as the basis of human freedom, from which essential implications for ethics and politics are then derived. I am to interrogate this habitual way of thinking through the Jewish philosopher Hans Jonas' study, The Phenomenon of Life, and by introducing the concept of grace into the debate. This perspective allows us to rethink the conditions under which human creativity arises and is compared to artificial creativity. If freedom is always bound up with necessity and dependency, as Jonas states, then perhaps our most celebrated acts of creation are not triumphs of autonomy alone, but moments that emerge precisely from our vulnerability. Jonas argues that an organism becomes truly active, truly free, only when it engages in exchange with its environment. We had that a few times already, which can plainly be defined as a metabolic process. In this sense, it is deeply dependent on its surroundings, caught in a dialectic between freedom and necessity. Every living organism continuously relies on its environment to provide what it cannot produce on its own, yet absolutely needs for its survival. In order to maintain itself, an organism is relentlessly driven into urgent relations with that which is external and other to the self, to obtain from it that which it cannot bring about by itself. According to Jonas, life is marked by a kind of poverty, by fragility and precariousness. It is always dependent on something it can never fully control, the world beyond itself. The organism's need drives it to reach beyond itself, toward the world. In order to actively persist in being, it must allow itself to be passively affected. My aim here is not to debate whether machines might be considered alive, although Jonas' work certainly offers intriguing avenues for such discussions. Rather, I want to apply his insights into freedom and the necessity that always accompanies it to the domain of human creativity. The crucial point I derive from Jonas is that fragility and autonomy don't exclude each other. My thesis is that this paradoxical relationship becomes intensified with regard to art. I want to show how every human act of creation necessarily involves a moment of fragility. Human creativity, more specifically artistic creation, also begins in engagement with the world and in the experience of being affected by it. But in perceiving the world, the artist encounters both a potential and a sense of lack. According to the German religious and cultural philosopher Romano Guardini, the artist perceives something in the world, in the ordinary, in the material, that is inherent in it, yet still imagined, not yet realized. An inner order of things, the essence of a phenomenon, of a movement, an object, or an experience. And it is this hidden meaning that demands to be revealed in a specific form. That's the call to the artwork. At the beginning of creativity, then, lies a longing for the work itself, a potential in the external world that resonates with an internal necessity within the artist. This fundamental longing, this fertile unrest, marks a crucial difference from artificial creativity. A machine's perception is limited to its initial programming and its input. It cannot move beyond its own categories, even if those are being advanced throughout the process. Human artistic perception, by contrast, begins with what is immediately given, but transcends this concreteness, reaching toward an ideal dimension from which it draws its creative impulse. This is what Flannery O'Connor refers to when she writes that in art, the sense of mystery is deepened in contact with reality, and the sense of reality is deepened in contact with mystery. The entire idea of art, as Guardini argues, presupposes that the ultimate, transcendent meaning of reality is not confined to the visible, though it cannot be conceived without it. It is precisely the invisibility or inaudibility or intangibility of this imagined form that generates the profound longing that drives the creative act. This longing, the fertile unrest at the heart of human creativity, stands in stark contrast to how artificial intelligence operates. Once properly programmed and supplied with what it materially needs, electricity for instance, AI experiences no lack. It can recognize tasks and even continuously present itself with new challenges. Yet it always remains within the boundaries of its programmed architecture. The intended output of AI stays within its frame of capabilities and possibilities, even if these become widened throughout the process, as I already said. The artwork an artist aspires to create, however, is not present from the beginning, not in any neurological setup in our brain, nor in the form of direct input we receive, for example, in experiences we have made. Rather, it is present as lack. What we possess is merely a sense, an intuition of beauty or perfection, even if we've never actually encountered it. Think of, for example, the idea of a perfectly symmetrical face. Here, of course, Plato's theory of errors as longing for beauty in the Symposium resounds. Artificial intelligence neither strives nor perceives, it merely consumes. It is not affected, it is being fed. And if it were not fed with training data, it would be no more or less itself than if it were instructed to produce a new Renaissance-style painting every minute. Artificial intelligence is not fragile. In fact, its very strength lies in being, if properly designed, resilient, self-contained, and capable of smooth, uninterrupted operations that may well surpass human understanding. This also leads to one of the defining features of artificial creativity. It is never surprised by its own results. And here lies another profound difference from human creativity. In human creation, the primacy of perception and receptivity means that the potential for a work may be recognized by the artist, but not produced by him. The artist responds to a necessity that exceeds him, one he does not fully comprehend. In that sense, the artist does not entirely know what he is doing, for the goal was not self-contained, but encountered from the outside, as something that affects him. The artist knows this goal only in negative terms, as necessity is absence, and his creative action is, in essence, a cooperation with an unknown other. While the human artist creates in response to a necessity he does not fully grasp, artificial intelligence operates under very different conditions. It responds to necessity it fully understands and processes. Its creations, at least from its own perspective, not from ours, are like puzzle pieces placed precisely where they belong, their position entirely calculated and comprehensible. AI always knows what it's doing. Every great human work, however, leaves behind a notion of surpassing. It surprises its creator, even though it was him who wrote or her who painted or shaped it. More than pride in a finished piece, what often dominates is the feeling, this had to be done. The shift towards performativity in modern art reflects this sense of uncontrollability and fragility in the creative process. Creativity, in its essence, is incalculable and unpredictable. There is no program that guarantees success, no formula that can be repeated at will. Similarly, O'Connor states that there is no technique that can be discovered and applied to write. Surely one can figure out how to produce best-selling books or award-winning paintings. But a work, quote, that is valuable in itself and that works in itself, by definition, escapes all attempts at functionalization and calculation. A true work of art, quote, will have its source in a realm much larger than that which the artist's conscious mind can encompass, and will always be a greater surprise to him than it can ever be to his recipient, end of quote. At this point, the Christian concept of grace comes to mind, as it encapsulates the paradoxical intertwining of freedom and dependence, of transcendent idea and concrete manifestation, of fragility and potential. Grace, in its simplest sense, refers to divine or transcendent favor and benevolence. It can manifest as kindness, help, or charm, and is often equated with God's love. However, rather than merely describing affection, it emphasizes that truth, goodness, or beauty, or whatever it is that one receives, appear as a gift. Thus, grace is constitutively beyond human grasp. It cannot be claimed or calculated. It is essentially uncontrollable, unexpected, and gratuitous. As such, grace marks the human being as fundamentally fragile and receptive, not as a moral deficit, but just as its essence. In the context of art, grace appears as super additum, that which, according to classical theology, is preceded by nature, by the perception of what is, and which humanity prepares space for through effort. Grace constitutes a potential demanding to be realized through art. It opens up a space for creative freedom, yet at the same time requires obedience to the material itself, precisely in line with Jonas' idea of needful freedom. Creating is an act of balance between obedience and dominance. The artist must obey the rules of the work, discern an inner meaning, submit to the material demands of wood, for example, and at the same time dominate it, transforming it in accordance with his vision and imagination. In art, it is not simply about letting one's creative skills run wild in self-expression. Rather, as O'Connor puts it, referring to Aquinas, in art, the self becomes self-forgetful in order to meet the demands of the thing seen and the thing being made. Creativity is thus marked by a profound experience of fragility and dependence, but in such a way that this does not hinder but enable creative freedom in the first place. AI's ability to bring forth any piece of art whatsoever is thus profoundly different from human artistic labor. One might even say that artificial intelligence is not creative but merely productive. As the application of the concept of grace to the realm of creativity illustrates, human limitation and dependency do not necessarily signify a deficit. Rather, they imply a potentiality that makes transformation and creative emancipation possible, transcending human capability and the constraints of given circumstances. The concept of grace entails both a dimension of receptiveness, dependency, or longing, since it is bestowed, as well as a transformative, emancipatory, and creative potential. It presupposes that human fragility is precisely what enables these moments of gift. Seen in this light, the human capacity for creation, often celebrated as proof for our uniqueness, might actually be rooted in something far more humble: our need, our openness, our fragility. One of humanity's central capacities lies in not being able to, in receiving, and in being affected and gifted. Grace, therefore, offers a powerful concept to counter current debates about the potential threat of artificial intelligence abilities, as it designates the paradoxical entanglement of freedom and dependence, of fragility and creativity. Thank you very much.
So we'll take one question first specifically for Johanna, and then we'll give the speakers a chance to engage with one another and open back up. The mic, can we get the mic over here?
I thank you for that. I think you provided a wonderful theoretical discourse. Earlier on, you mentioned almost as a throwaway that we might see in the future AI, works produced by AI receiving awards. Yeah. Based on what you described, is there any premise on which you think we can distinguish work that's generated by AI versus others that are produced through the human process you just described, and through which we might differently judge those artistic works?
So I'm not a computer scientist, but I honestly think there is no way to, or there might not be a way to distinguish a piece of art. I mean, with recently produced works, you see something's off, something's missing, but I think it might be, there is a possibility that it might not be able. And the question of what that means then for the perception, because I focused on the creative act, and I think it would be interesting to ask the same questions from the receptive point of view, what it means for the reception of a painting, and whether looking at a human-made painting that is very, very good and an artificially created one, whether there are any differences. Phenomenologically, but also psychologically, that would be very interesting.
Thank you. So an opportunity at this time, if any of the speakers would like to ask a question or make a comment about the intersections among your papers.
I have one for each of you, actually. I'll start with you, Johanna. I have a question about the distinction you make between creativity and productivity. A question about the distinction you make between creativity and productivity in relation to human makers. Especially, I want to relate this to kind of the doctrine of creation. And on some concerns of the doctrine of creation, humans, properly speaking, don't create anything, but produce only in relation to materials that are already there, and only strictly speaking created by God. And I wonder what you would think of that, and what your kind of conception of grace as creating the possibilities for creating something new might shake that up a little bit.
Yeah, so I think that is true, of course, but the specific place of art also within Christian theology is that because of the gratuity of the work of art, it mirrors the gratuity of creation. And that is why grace and art in classical theology has this very eschatological dimension in that every work of art signals towards a possible perfection and transformation of the cosmos as such. That is where art derives its deep value from, and why a sculpture produced from a piece of wood is different than a chair produced from a piece of wood. And this, precisely this mirroring of creation is what lifts art, even though it's humbled because it only works with what it receives from creation. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. I'll ask the question to Jordan now. I wonder if you think anything is lost in something like the use of a GPS, and if so, what? And if not, then nothing.
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, I'm not going to say nothing's lost in the sense that all attempts to sort of have functional measurement systems that allow us to do things involve some loss of information. And we might even think that this, of course, affects our practices as well, like perhaps with certain kinds of GPS technologies, we're now very concerned about arriving at the destination and less concerned with other goods that might impinge on how we get there. You know, stopping to smell the roses and all that kind of thing. I'm not sure, so there's not nothing. I'm not sure I am as worried about it from like a moral or ethical perspective, in part because of the way it doesn't seem to, let me put it another way. If there's a problem, I'm not sure the problem is exactly generated by the GPS system as much as larger social structures that say it's more important for us to get to point B fast than to smell the roses. Yeah. And that system might just be kind of aligning with these larger structures that we might raise questions about. But yeah, thank you.
Anything else, or would you like to open up?
I think we can open up.
Okay, so it's back to you. And I know there were hands that went up at various points, so this is the opportunity, yes. And if I could have a couple of volunteers who are local people run around with the mic, I'd be grateful.
So first of all, fantastic, you guys. These were really great papers. And there's one connection I think I want to draw out, maybe for the three of you to comment on. First, a little comment. I think, Johanna, your description of AI to me sounded a little more like classical computer programming, where there are boundary conditions that, you know, whereas AI, you know, it's because it's just algorithmic weights, it's really not constrained in that same way as classical, and that's sort of the whole feature of AI, right? So I wonder, though, if that idea of the phenomenology of a gift, which I really like, is more about the ability of it to be self-reflective on its limitations and on the receipt of gift. Like a human artist can recognize, I don't know where this came from. But an AI, as far as we know, can't really do that, right? And I would, maybe ask all of you to kind of reflect on that idea of the phenomenology of gift in this kind of same context, right? Similar with kind of McIntyre's idea of teleology, and similar with the AI system can't, reflect on this caller.
Yeah.
Was first to you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. It's So I think for the first part, the first thing you said, the crucial a question for me is the question of perception, and I think that what Jonas describes as an organism, I really think that all of that applies to a machine. That you can't say that like in that sense you can't have this traditional aversion to computers, because they really do live just like these organisms Jonas portrays. So maybe I should have fleshed that out, or I should have shown that more clear, that is not the part where I think that a machine is different from a human, or a computer, or a artificial intelligence. And yeah, I think that that's precisely that the gift is the notion, or if you want to use the word grace, where I think that that an algorithm doesn't, there's no space for a gift. There's space for data and for input, but that's not the same as receptiveness in lack, because it's that's what I meant when I talked about the self-contained goal. It's really identical with what it can obtain, whereas I think the human capability has, like, it's really an outward thing that calls us to do it, and there's like it's totally external and genuinely other.
Thanks for the question. I quite like that question in relation to what I consider myself to be doing. I think I'll answer it in terms of the relationship between reading and kind of AI generating a summary of conclusions from a given text. I consider the first to open up possibilities for receiving gifts in a way the second, the possibilities for receiving gifts just do not kind of cohere with the second in quite the same way. The gift of knowing the conclusions, but not just knowing the conclusions, but also tracing an argument, and in that way kind of being transformed into one who's able to think differently, kind of reading deeply, and this is not to kind of reject the place of helpful summaries or knowing a conclusion of an argument before you read it, but to say that you lose the gift character that's often kind of spontaneously given to you in the process of reading an argument, especially arguments written 1500, 1600, 1700 years ago. If you know, for instance, something of what Augustine thinks about divine impassibility, that it's good to know that, but the transformative effect of knowing how and why he was able to get there, and knowing how and why forces, kind of social forces and intellectual forces around him enabled him to get there, you're just not going to get that. So that's probably how I'd start to answer that question.
Yeah. I also really like this question. This notion of the phenomenology of gift, which came out of Johanna's talk and you've tied together, I think really does get to the heart of some of what I was trying to articulate. So for me, I think of it in terms of what we might call the direction of fit between these two different kinds of agential systems. So one of the striking things about these propositional functional agents, as I'm calling AI, is they tend to be very projective, right? The value is not in their representations of the world, it's projected onto the world as something to be produced. It's kind of bootstrapped on in a way as an arbitrary weight that's been given in its initial programming. And this can be reflexively modified, but it's still not something that it's responding to. It's something that it's projecting. And that's why, essentially, these agents are productive. They produce things. In contrast, we as humans, I think, can have lots of different relations to value. Like, we can delight in something. We can want to just bask in the glory of something in a way that has no intention to make the world conform to our perception of it, but instead just wants to rest in it. And that seems like a very different way of approaching value, for sure. Yeah.
Benjamin.
Hello, thank you all for your talks. This is mostly for Jordan, but I think can tie into the other two as well. It strikes me that one of the consequences of this agential mismatch could lead to, and I think in your talk you talk about it, does lead to a misunderstanding of what human agency is. So even in moments where we're not like using AI in that immediate moment, the use of AI can lead us to misunderstand human agency as functional. If that's the case, what might that look like? And what might the consequences for that kind of misunderstanding be?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad you asked this because, as you all may have noticed, I panicked towards the end of my paper because I was running out of time and skipped over some stuff. But one thing, so I think this is very true. This is very possible. And in fact, what I was calling possession by agreement sometimes has this character where the person so possessed sort of takes up in their own life, even when they're not currently integrated with an AI model, a sort of evaluative outlook that approximates this way of thinking about value. I don't think it can be totalizing because we are not that kind of agent, but I do think we can approximate this sort of thing. And I think the examples, I mean, you know, think of stories of like the CEO that's worked so long in a corporation that they start to kind of think like a corporation even in other areas of their life, or the person who has been in a kind of military bureaucracy so long that they start to really just move through other aspects of their life in that way and ignore, you know, other salient values that might be worth paying attention to. I think that the limit case of this is the sort of Nazi prison camp guard case, where the person is in some way just acting as the institution in a way that they're sort of completely blind to other values that might be salient. Now, what would that look like in the context of AI specifically? I mean, the case of the operator, I mean, I don't know that person. I don't know how much they were sort of informed by that way of thinking about the value of the people they're serving in this medical context. But we could certainly imagine scenarios where you've used an AI system so much to determine the value of like a job candidate, let's say, or the value of who gets medical care, that even outside of using that algorithmic system, you just start to see people in these categories. And that would be the kind of thing that I would be worried about, for sure.
Here in the front.
Yes, thank you. This is a question for Sean, and it's about patience. What is the purpose of patience in theology? Is it to achieve a state of intuition, a state of connection with the divine? And so when you mentioned patience, I was thinking, okay, an AI system can run longer, meaning be more patient, to dig in deeper and find something more inspirational, perhaps. So can we reflect on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. When I in this paper, I think of patience primarily as a virtue that teaches us who we are, and in that sense is different from the kind of, I don't think of it primarily or simply just as patience as the ability to sit for a really extended period of time with a text, but also patience with the kind of fundamental limitations of what it is to be human, and patience with the unverifiability or the only eschatological verifiability of theological claims. So that I think I would distinguish the sort of patience that you were indexing to the capabilities of AI as more perseverance than patience. I mean, they're related, but I think I would want to call that more perseverance than patience, and say that patience in this context functions primarily to teach us and remind us who we are in relation to one another and in relation to God. And if we lose that or give that up in relation to, and I think there's a point of connection here with what Jordan was saying, if we lose that or voluntarily give that up so as to kind of reap the rewards of what AI can give us, we misconstrue and may at some point be fundamentally incapable of construing to ourselves who we are in relation to God and others and the world around us. But that's a great question. Thank you.
This is a question for Johanna, and I'm interested in the location of agency within the creation of art. And how your argument might shift if rather than the AI being the creative agent, the one who prompted the AI or the developer of the AI might be understood as either primary or co-agent. And I'm thinking about this sort of in the relationship or the distinction between AI as tool, sort of qua brush or chisel, versus AI as standalone artist, or maybe AI as collaborator in the sense of like, you know, the workshop of Lucas Cranach the Elder, you know, creates the work of art, but Cranach gets the attribution. So how might those differently located senses of agency relate to creativity with AI?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that's a very important distinction, and I think without doubt AI can be and should be used as a tool for creativity because it is part of this world, and true art engages with the world as it is. And so I do think that that the art to come will have to engage and make use and also use AI as its object much more in the future. But it is exactly the difference you make, that then it is not, like the artificial intelligence is not seen as the artist as such, which is a problematic category, as you say, with workshops. It's not like we had like Rubens or Raphael did these paintings, but I think that only further strengthens that point I was trying to make, that Flannery O'Connor quote, that an artwork comes from a realm that is not quite controllable, and to say that the workshop produced it is also not quite right. So yeah, it's a very good illustration of the problematic. Yeah.
While we're getting the mic over there, Jordan, I wondered did you have any thoughts on that question? Because you were arguing AI can't just be a tool.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take I'll say one very brief thing, which is, I think the important thing from my perspective is that, especially with these generative models, I would be more suspicious of calling it a tool of artists, but more happy with talking about it in terms of a collaboration or a workshop, precisely because it is an agency, and it's important to recognize that it's making sort of selection choices that are genuinely agential choices, and thus can raise questions about like the differences of value between how the AI collaborator is choosing and how you as the sort of managing artist are trying to prompt it to do what you want it to do. But I think if you recognize that, I think it would be really interesting actually to think about agency in this collaborative way in the context of art. Yeah, for sure.
This is a question for Jordan. I was really struck and really loved the notion of a diabolical exchange, so maybe I can kind of play devil's advocate for a second.
Yeah, please.
You can certainly understand AIs as agents, but AI also exists as a product that's produced by a corporation. And corporations there's a long history of corporations using all sorts of techniques to influence people's way of thinking in ways that are often invisible to them through all kinds of subtle design. So I'm curious if you see AIs as being different in degree or different in kind from the other ways that agency is influenced already by corporations.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So an entire section of the paper that did not make it into the talk is about this very topic. I think it's not actually as much a difference of kind as people might think it is. And this is in part because, so that the whole discussion of propositional agents, these functional agents, that comes out of discussions in philosophy of group agency. So the accounts, the functional agential accounts of corporations and institutions models AI in some way, or I guess it's the other way around. AI is very similar to these kinds of accounts of corporations. And so I think you have similar dangers. I think the thing that's novel is when corporations incorporate your agency as like an employee, they do it in part by fragmenting you, right? So all the corporation cares about is this particular task you do for them in your role as employee. It extracts that agential power from you and uses that to do whatever, right? that can have like feelings of alienation associated with it. There's all various kinds of ways in which corporations try to deal with that, like making up we narratives and all this kind of stuff. But that's the kind of fundamental agential harm that's going on there. I think that's subtly different than these personal AI products, which are you're being invited to incorporate into your own agency as a tool. Both of these might be a kind of possession. I haven't fully thought out the group agency case, but I think they structure that possession slightly differently. An interesting theological project would, think about the difference between like a principality and a power on the one hand, maybe those are corporations, versus like the devil on your shoulder on the other hand, which might be the AI. But I'll just say, I don't think it's an accident that corporations really like AI. There's kind of a fittingness to it, right? They're both the same kind of agent, so of course they work well together, so. Yeah.
So I'm sure we could go on for some time, but we are at time. In a moment, I'll invite you to join me in thanking our speakers for getting us off to such a wonderful start. But I just want to let you know there's lunch for everybody in the adjacent common room. You're free to bring it back in here to eat if you'd like to sit at a table. We will resume right at 1:30. And when you do come back, I encourage you to perhaps consider moving toward this end of the room where there's a lot more space, because we'll continue to have some latecomers coming in on the other side. And also just a note that there are restrooms on both sides. If it's more convenient to go out to that side, you may. So please join me in thanking our speakers.